Baldur's Gate 3 is almost here, so grab your dice, your party to hit the streets, mingling with good guys and bad guys and everything in between. But in this video, what we're going to do is break down party composition, what you need to know about making a good party in Baldur's Gate 3. Let's go! Let me know in the comments who is going to be in your main party. Now, there's a couple of things to consider when making a party. There's obviously combat, and the other side of things is the social aspects of Baldur's Gate 3, which is a core part of the role-playing experience. So we're going to talk about mostly combat here, but this is going to be a bit of an introductory video to a little bit of a series that we're going to do breaking down some of the different roles in Baldur's Gate 3, but I wanted to talk about social first. Now, social is important because in Baldur's Gate 3 and D&D as well, the role-play aspect and the skills are a huge part of the game. And, a clear example of this, right, just to simplify things, is the charisma skill in dialogue and being able to persuade enemies with the persuasion skill. Now, if you are proficient in persuasion, you'll get a proficiency bonus to add to the dice roll along with your charisma modifier. So this will happen for all skill checks, right? So you'll always get a modifier added based on the ability that it's actually using. And then if you're proficient in the skill it's using, you'll get another bonus on top of that. So when that comes to like the social aspects, really, you sort of want a relatively good breadth of skills covered by your party. Now, you could essentially go and try and like min-max and cover every single skill in the game, which is probably possible, but there is some fun in failing. So, not always passing every check. You obviously want to be proficient in some things and succeed in some ways, but sometimes it's okay to fail. And I think that in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, it's actually a lot of fun in, say, maybe your main talker who's going to be in all conversations has like zero charisma and is a bumbling idiot. It sounds like a good time in a way. But when you're thinking about these checks, you want to have someone in your party that is proficient in the dexterity skills, potentially someone who's proficient in the intelligence and wisdom skills, and then definitely someone who's proficient in the charisma skills. Now, you can break this out in different ways. Like you can say just have a rogue like Astarion just know all the dexterity skills and focus on all the dexterity stuff. You can have a wizard like Gale focus on all the intelligence things, or you can just have a character that's sort of a breadth across the board. But something that I would consider when making a party is having some sort of a main talker, someone with the charisma skills that you can use for, say, persuasion or intimidation, those sort of things. Then someone with the dexterity based skills, someone that can lockpick or has sleight of hand is really important. And then someone that will cover, say, the intelligence and wisdom skills sort of in your last sort of two characters. But there are other ways to buff yourself as well. Like there are skills that can increase your chance of getting a success on a roll, or even Animal Whisperer, which is a great skill so that you can actually talk to animals. So there is different ways that you can think about this, but just sort of broadly speaking, you want to think about those skills and trying to cover as many as possible. And I guess another point as well is the approval ratings with your companions, because the companions in the game will have approval ratings based on what you, the player character, do. So obviously if they don't like you, they can leave your party or potentially even attack you. So that's worth thinking about. But you can obviously just have hirelings as well that you can hire instead, so they don't actually have any sort of ratings towards you. But the main crux of this video and of the reason to have a party composition is for actual combat. Now, a couple of tips before we get into the nitty gritty. Ranged combat is very advantageous in Baldur's Gate 3 as many combat encounters are spread out, and mages and sort of ranged characters using bows and crossbows have a huge advantage because they can actually attack from range and just immediately start attacking enemies at the start of combat. Generally speaking as well, I would try and avoid having two characters that are of the same class or using the same equipment types. Say if you've got two people that are using great swords and you find this amazing great sword, who will you give it to? There are plenty of different weapon options and spell options and different sort of setups in Baldur's Gate 3 that you shouldn't really be having characters use the same sort of weapons unless you're specifically going for some sort of bombastic build. So generally speaking, talking about party composition, you want to have a mix of classes and archetypes that fill different roles in combat encounters. What I mean by that is you want to have a character, let's say a tank. Now this would be a high hit point and a high armor class character. Armor class is determined by the character's dexterity as well as the armor they're wearing, and anytime a character attacks that character, they have to roll an attack dice, which is then compared to the armor class of that character. So the higher the armor class, the less chance they'll get hit. But then if they do get hit, they have a higher chance of surviving that hit, right? Because they've got a higher amount of health. So it fits sort of like a tank archetype, but not necessarily a tank. It doesn't have to be specifically, but a melee character is definitely the focus there. Now, generally, the classes that fit that sort of a mold is a fighter, a barbarian, and a paladin, because they have good armor proficiencies, other than the barbarian that gets unarmored defense as an alternative, but they have good armor proficiencies so they can wear armor armor, have that higher armor class, and take some of those hits with their higher health pool. A monk could also fit this role as well because they are typically melee focused with unarmored combat. Companion wise, you've got Lae'zel as a fighter and Karlach as a barbarian that can fill this role for you as part of the companion party members that can join your team. The second role is a sort of support healer / buffer. Now this can be either melee or ranged, but the role of this role, I guess, is to be a support character. Now that doesn't necessarily always mean healing your party members when they are low on health, as there are other ways to do that, but the main focus here as well is on buffing and debuffing enemies. Buffing yourself and debuffing enemies is a huge part of D&D and also Baldur's Gate. It's actually more beneficial than you may realize, because if you say debuff your enemy with something like Bane or give them disadvantage on their attack roll, it essentially means they have to roll 2 dice and take the lowest figure of that dice and then compare it to the armor class of the character that they're attacking. So you've got a extra chance of avoiding that damage, right? And vice versa, say if you're using a way to buff your characters and increase their chance of hitting by like adding extra dice to their attack rolls or advantage, that sort of a thing, then you are giving yourself a more guaranteed way to deal damage. It's a very important part of D&D and Baldur's Gate 3 in general, so it's worth considering. Now, this is really filled by a couple of different classes. So you've got the cleric that can fill this role, you've got a druid, especially a Circle of Land druid that can fill this role, bards with their bardic inspiration and other spells can absolutely fill this role, and then there's some other options as well depending on the way that you build them, like paladins and rangers and that sort of a thing. But for the most part, this role is filled by someone that can do some spell casting to heal and do the debuffs and buffs. But in terms of companions, this is currently only really fillable by Shadowheart as a cleric. She can fill the healing role plus the buffing and debuffing, though the chances is that Halsin the Druid may also be a companion in the full version of the game, so if they can, they probably can. It's also worth mentioning as well that chances are there are going to be more companions that we don't necessarily know about, like maybe 1 or 2 secret ones, so maybe there's more when the full game comes out, but obviously at this stage we don't rightly know. Moving on to the ranged damage dealer. Now typically this will be some sort of a mage character, but you could also absolutely run some sort of a martial based with a crossbow, that sort of a thing, character as well. But essentially this role is like an all-out, not necessarily glass cannon, but definitely a high damage dealer from range. This, in terms of classes, can be covered by the Warlock, the Wizard, and the Sorcerer, typically as your mage-based ones with a lot of cantrips that can deal damage, as well as spell slots that they can use to do damage from range. And then in the martial way, you've got things like a Ranger, a Rogue, or potentially a Fighter if you choose to specialize in archery. But those are the sort of the key ones that you've got that you can look for this sort of a role. Now, this isn't a requirement to have a role like this, but it is absolutely worth doing because of how beneficial ranged combat is, like I mentioned earlier in Baldur's Gate 3, because of these massive arenas that have these huge landscapes as well as a lot of verticality, and when you're up on high ground you can get advantage on some of those attack rolls, so it's absolutely worth considering having someone like this in your party. In terms of your companions, you've got Gale that fills this role as a wizard, you've got Will, this fills this role as a warlock, and Astarion can fill this role as well as a rogue if you want to keep him on sort of a ranged basis, but there's plenty of options that you can sort of fit there. Now, other than those 3 as the main primary, I personally think that this 4th slot is like a personal preference flex slot. And what I mean by that is you can sort of fill this role with anything that's sort of fun to you, and I think that this fits where your player character can go if you don't want to specifically have your player character as either sort of the tanky or the healery or the ranged damage dealer. You can just sort of have them as a fun character that can do anything and everything or something in between that sort of fits neatly into this role. Now, if you don't necessarily want that, like if you want to know what I would suggest to have as that 4th slot, I would either be looking to have the other alternative. Say is your ranged damage dealer, you've got a mage, you could have some sort of a melee rogue that can deal damage sort of from a stealthy position, or you could even just have another ranged martial dealer, like say having a ranger that can deal damage from range with a bow, specializing in the hunter aspects of that kit, and then having the mage specialize in the spells from range gives you that flexibility. Or you could just have 2 melee fighters, you know, something like that. But I'll also give you some examples of some like general party setup. So if you want to play like a support role, let's say a bard, because bards are great talkers because of their high charisma, as well as their great skills and jack of all trades skill that they can get as well. Let's say you're playing a bard as a support character, you can then run Lae'zel as your tank setup. You've got Astarion as a rogue playing that sort of flex role, and then you've got Gale as the mage damage dealer. Another alternative is if you want to play as a melee barbarian or fighter or paladin or something in between, you could then play that sort of a tanky role. You could bring Shadowheart along with you to play that support role, and then then in this example, you could run Will as a flex damage dealer that can do a little bit of melee, but mostly focuses on spells. And then you've got Gale as well as your wizard damage, or you could then switch out either Will or Gale for Astarion or something in that sort of flex position. But I hope that helps you think about your party composition in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I will also say that based on subclasses and specific ways you can build out these classes and even multi-classing, these classes that I'm giving you as these specific like archetypes and roles aren't necessarily going to fit that role. Like you can build them out in different ways if you so choose to, right? You know, there's nothing stopping you from using the wizard's quarterstaff to just melee enemies all the time, right? Like if you want to make a melee wizard, you could do that and just whack people in the face with a staff. Like there's no reason you could do that, or you can multi-class them into different ways, right? There's a lot of flexibility there, but I just wanted to give you sort of a broad overview of things to consider when building out your party and thinking about covering these different aspects of the different compositions. So let me know your party in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.